Are your benefits what they need to be? Are they meaningful? Are they usable? You could give staff all of the vacation time in the world, but if they don't have someone to back up that work when they're not there, it's functionally worthless.
I'm Rich Frazier.
And I'm Russ Phaneuf.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement.
We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector.
Let's dive in. Hello, listeners, and Happy New Year. Welcome to Season 3 of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. I'm co-host Rich Frazier. I'm Senior Consultant for IPM Advancement.
And I'm co-host Russ Phaneuf, Managing Director and Chief Strategist for IPM. Today, our topic is what nonprofits should watch out for in 2022.
Hey, Russ. Happy New Year.
Hey, Happy New Year to you.
You know, 2020 was rough. 2021 was pretty rough. So 2022, turns out there's a lot of downstream side effects to the pandemic. And this whole supply chain thing is going to be impacting a lot of us and a lot of nonprofits around the country.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because when we started talking about this episode, we thought, you know, what do nonprofits need to just be aware of? What do most organizations have to watch out for? And this was a good chance for us to talk about some kind of broad trends that are affecting a lot of people that we talk to. And so I guess where we wanted to start with this is by introducing our guest. Our guest is a nonprofit expert who is here on staff with us at IPM Advancement, and her name is Samantha Timlick.
Hi, guys. Yep, this is Samantha Timlick, VP of Client Services here with IPM Advancement, and I'm so excited to be joining you for our first podcast of the year.
Hey, Samantha. Welcome. It's nice to have this trio together on this podcast. We're going to sound like we know what we're talking about today, right?
Absolutely. That's what I'm here for.
As best we can, Rich. As best we can.
Okay. So where do we start? Because there's a lot to unpack here.
I think that where we really started with the idea for this podcast was sort of me and my team raising the alarm as we started to pull together our direct mail schedules for this year, which obviously we do, toward the end of last year, and started hearing from our various printer partners across the country that we needed to be looking at much longer timelines. And we honestly even had some trouble with a few of our calendar year-end mailings last year where we had some delays. And that's really being driven by paper shortage and labor shortage. So paper is not as readily available. That means that things are more expensive. And it means it takes us longer to get a package from being with the printer to actually being in the mail. So after sort of talking with various printers, we've come up with what seems to be more standard timelines moving into this year. The big thing that nonprofits want to watch out for as far as their direct mail packages are concerned is going to be their outside envelopes. Those seem to be causing the biggest delays, and in particular, non-standard envelopes. So traditionally at IPM, we were working with about a 3-week production timeline. So about 3 weeks from everything to the printer to being in the mail. This year, we are working with about a 10-week delay for envelopes alone. So whatever envelope you need for a mailing, you're looking at needing to place the order for that about 10 weeks in advance.
Wow.
Can I interrupt you for just 1 second? Why envelopes? Why is that the factor here?
Rich, I think if I remember correctly, when I was in the trenches, there were a few times where we had to order envelopes and they had to ship them from overseas.
So all of our envelopes are sitting in a ship off the port of Los Angeles.
Maybe.
Envelopes are considered a specialty print item. And so many printers don't actually produce their envelopes in-house. They do have to be ordered outside of house. And so if we're talking a standard number 10 window envelope or a number 10, even a closed-faced envelope, that is an often used item. So they tend to have a lot of stock available. When you start looking into things like pistol window envelopes, those are the ones with kind of like the weird shape window or oversized window envelopes, anything that comes out, is beyond the standard window, left side window or a closed face number 10, that's where printers typically don't have that material in stock. And so they have to special order it from whomever they're getting it from. So about a 10-week delay looking at envelopes in general. The other thing you got to watch out for on envelopes is anytime you're printing and converting. So if you have art on your package that doesn't have a white frame around the edges of it, and it's an envelope, that's typically a print convert. So the envelopes are printed as a big flat piece of paper, and then they are folded into envelope shape. We're also seeing, particularly long delays on those. What you really want to do in order to try and address this is work with whoever is doing your direct mail, whether you're a small nonprofit that's working with a local printer or whether you're a larger nonprofit who's working with a fundraiser like IPM Advancement. The key here is having these conversations about what can be gotten when and how far in advance you need to be planning in order to secure that paper. Because the other thing that we're finding is that printers are having to work on allotments with the mills that they're getting paper from. So they have to sort of in advance tell these paper mills, okay, I'm going to need, 1 million number 10 envelopes in 3 months. Then that becomes their allotment. Any change, they need more envelopes, they may not be able to get it. So you've got to plan in advance. You don't necessarily have to place your order in advance or have your art too much in advance, but you've got to know it's coming. So it's really working with the folks who are actually doing the production to figure out what sort of timelines you need to be working with and focusing on those envelopes, especially when they are non-standard.
What I'm hearing you say is that communication is really key here. So between companies like ours and clients, these are the timelines that you can expect. They're different than what they've been in the past. But I think perhaps communication is also very important on the nonprofit side. So if you're the development director in a nonprofit who's used to putting out a direct mail package at the end of November, you might want to start communicating with your executive director and your board of directors and managing their expectations too, in case they're not up to speed on the changing world of direct mail and direct response right now and what the supply chain is handing us. The other thing I heard you say was really have your act together. Coordinate with those who are putting together your direct mail package. Get your plan together early and don't make last minute changes. Yeah?
That's absolutely right. I mean, you really have to be planning in advance and not just from a when are we mailing who perspective, but also what are we going to say? Because particularly when it comes to that outside envelopes, I could hear some people hearing this and thinking, oh, well, that's fine. We can design our envelopes way in advance. We don't even necessarily have to know what's inside. But the reality is you're not going to be able to generate donations if you can't get people into that envelope. So very often creatively, we're not writing the tagline for the envelope until the package is done, until we can really make it something compelling that's going to, someone's going to put their hands on it and want to open it. It's like we sort of have to shift how we've traditionally approached things, even from a creative perspective, to make sure that we're still getting people, some would argue that the envelope can actually be the most important part of the package, because if you don't get someone in, you don't even have a chance to make your case for support.
So Samantha, let me ask you this, as the skeptic of the group, why not just throw out direct mail, replace it with web and email and basically running online ads? What do you think about the digital play?
I like that you asked this question because I get it all of the time, even before we start talking about paper shortages and delays, because it's frustrating. Clients are trying to figure out how they're supposed to identify what they're talking about 3 months before it's going to go in the mail. Direct mail is still absolutely critical to your fundraising efforts. We've seen that, studies have shown that response rates on direct mail has been rising 43% year over year. I mean, that's crazy. Even prospect response rates to direct mail have more than doubled in recent years. I don't know if this is a function of there being less mail. I can't speak for everyone else, but I know in my mailbox, I'm getting way fewer circulars and flyers, and just it felt like there was this point where there was so much mail, it was hard to rise above the noise. I feel like the volume is starting to drop, perhaps because of things like these delays or, USPS cutting back on deliveries and whatnot. I don't know if that's allowing nonprofits to sort of rise up, but people are responding to direct mail. The USPS, obviously they have a skewed view of the situation, but they did a study that said that 67% of Americans felt that physical mail was a more personal outreach than online. So, whether we're talking re-engaging lapsed donors or bringing new people onto your file, making that personal connection is absolutely critical. And direct mail appears to do that in a way that online communications, whether it be email or ads or what have you, just can't.
Samantha, would it be a fair question to ask that nonprofits rebalance their direct mail versus digital but not throw everything at digital, but maybe do more digital than direct mail during this time right now?
I think it depends. So where digital really pulls ahead is when you need to, in rapid response situations. So if you need to get in front of people quickly, you can't wait 3 months for direct mail. And it's not always going to be 3 months, right? Like maybe you have a mailing already going out. You can add a buck slip insert. We're not seeing as long of delays on other types of paper. So as opposed to 10 weeks for an envelope, other things are more like 6 weeks when they used to be 3 weeks. So still doubling, but at least not tripling. So there is some opportunity to you sort of add pieces to your direct mail. But when we're talking rapid response, we're often talking online anyway, because you have hours, days to get in front of people, and direct mail could never keep up with that to begin with. So I think you can look at shifting resources to digital as needed, but you still really need that rapid response situation to make the investment worthwhile, because we're still continuing to see that online fundraising is much more challenging, particularly online prospecting. It's not competing with direct mail in a meaningful way.
One of the things that I'd like to mention too on this issue of rapid response and digital fundraising, there is a real challenge in getting digital donors to give year after year after year and become consistent donors. This is something that the Red Cross struggles with. This is something that basically everybody who gets a huge influx of donors and dollars after something happens, there's a real struggle to renew those donors and keep them in the fold. I think, some of the numbers out there are in maybe the 10, 20%, 30% at best in terms of who you're going to be able to keep year over year.
That's a good point, Russ. And we see that when we're looking at lifetime value analyses for clients. Oftentimes, donors who give via direct mail will have a higher lifetime value than those who give online.
I want to go back to rapid response. Speaking of rapid response, let's talk about the United States Postal Service. I'm sorry. For those of you who represent the United States Postal Service, it was only a joke. But one of the factors impacting the direct mail system right now is the slowdown of the USPS and postage rates going up. So speed going down, cost going up.
We even saw this toward the end of 2021. Typically, when we're planning our schedules for year-end mailings and even late fall mailings, we're allowing a 3-week delivery timeline. This past year, we were seeing more like 3.5 weeks, 4 weeks in some cases. And especially when you're talking about year end, where, a ton of revenue for nonprofits is coming in, that can be really nerve wracking. So what we're suggesting to clients moving into this year, which is really no different than what we've always suggested, we just are keeping a better handle on it, is whenever you're sending out a mailing, you should be seating yourself. And that means putting your own team's addresses in the mailing. Ideally, if you're a national mailer, sending it to people across the country and watching when those pieces are arriving. Because if you're using nonprofit postage, there is no tracking. You really got to track it yourself. So IPM has the benefit of, sending out tons of mailings. We're able to start identifying those trends as they're happening. But absolutely, USPS has tended to slow down year over year. They have already said that they're going to increase nonprofit postage rates again this year, potentially twice, and that moving forward, they plan to increase postage rates at least annually or biannually. So when you're building your budgets, typically we're not seeing a huge swing in postage, but every penny counts, right? So
Right.
When you're building your budgets for the year, you may want to look at adding, 3 cents to your postage rate or 5 cents to your postage rate as you're planning your budgets moving into this year.
Given the rising costs of paper, the slowdown of delivery, the complication that envelopes throw into the mix. Are you advising clients then to simplify their packages?
It depends, as with most things. I think that I feel like I give that answer a lot, but it depends, because if you are a nonprofit who has run A/B testing and you know that your donors respond a certain way to a given package, I would be very hesitant to make changes. So for example, in spring, we have several clients who send out a supporter card mailing. It is a more expensive mailing, and it is a more complex mailing. It's like a laminated card that peels off of the reply form. In the past, we during other economic downturns, we have had clients choose to not send out that mailing and try something else. And donors have complained, results have been lower. I mean, I was shocked to even hear, it's a paper card. Like, do people really care about it? Apparently the answer is yes. So if you have sort of those staple packages that your donors are used to seeing year over year, I'd be very hesitant to change those. But if you're getting ready to do a mailing and you have to make a decision between a print and convert envelope, or you can still go 4 colors, but just sort of keep your art in the edges of the envelope, and you can save 3 to 4 weeks of production, I would rather get a package out in spring than wait 4 weeks and drop in summer when response tends to not be as high. So it's a cost benefit, analysis.
So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But this probably isn't the time to try to do something new and fancy for experimentation's sake.
I think one of the other takeaways too is, if you're going to make changes, you better make sure that your changes are defensible, so that if your executive director or your VP or your CEO or a board member asks you to justify why you made that decision, you're able to defend that decision.
Manage expectations.
Yes, exactly.
100%.
So Samantha, how do you summarize all of this? What are your recommendations then for nonprofits?
I think we can really summarize it in 2 key takeaways, and that's plan ahead and manage expectations. 2 things that we said here. You need to be working with your production team, whether it be a vendor or whomever, if you're doing it in-house, figure out where the limitations are, what sort of things need to be ordered in advance, and what you can plan to order in advance. And obviously speaking with your creative team about then what that means for them, and when content needs to be prepared, what can be done in advance, what needs to be held. And then managing expectations with folks who might come to you suddenly and be like, hey, we need to get a mailer out real quick. Just letting people know in advance that that's not the landscape that we're in, and that we're probably going to be in this position for at least the rest of this year, and potentially even the next 18 months, so middle of next year.
Hi, this is Curtis Schmidt, producer of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, jumping in for a moment. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM Advancement, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details, and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
What else are you seeing on your list of things to look for in 2022?
The next big thing that's sort of on my mind and on the minds of a lot of our clients is, you might have heard it in the news or online. They're calling it the Great Resignation. So, and nonprofit fundraising is already famous for sort of revolving doors, right? That's part of where IPM came from, is really seeing this need for consistency in annual fundraising that you're not always getting within your staff, because let's face it, like, this is tough work, and it's really hard to do day in and day out. So we can see short tenures in this work. So this Great Resignation, where is it coming from? People looking for opportunities because they've sort of been locked down for the last couple of years and unsure about where the world is going. Offices are reopening, right? But we have these people who have been working remotely and have kind of fallen in love with it. So I think that there's going to be a segment of the population who just doesn't want to go back. And so if they are working for an employer that expects them to physically be in the office and that's not something they want to do anymore, they're going to look for remote opportunities.
Which opens up positions in those places that are going back to the office. So you have new positions in live office settings that are now open, and people are going to those jobs as well, right? And so everybody's sort of shuffling around. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what that means is that nonprofits really want to make sure that they've got processes and procedures written and in place so that as people are leaving and new people are coming on, they know where to get started. I've spoken with a few different clients who have lost folks at the end of last year, and they really just didn't know what to do because we ask our nonprofit fundraisers to do so much that it's really challenging to sort of hand that off in a way that's meaningful and actionable. So as far as like, what do we do about this? I would say that's one of the big things for nonprofits to look at is making sure that there's a knowledge base that's easily transferable as new staff comes in. I think the other thing to do here is to really, we've talked about this before, look at your staff as an asset and treat it as such. So you need to be investing time and resources into your staff, your volunteers, making sure that you're listening to them. What is it that's working well within your organization from their perspective? What's not working well? Is it benefits? Some nonprofits and other organizations are looking to moving to a 4-day work week. Maybe that's something that would work for you. Are your benefits what they need to be? Are they meaningful? Are they usable? You could give staff all of the vacation time in the world, but if they don't have someone to back up that work when they're not there, it's functionally worthless.
I was recently visiting with a client who told me that he was hemorrhaging staff through this Great Resignation. And what this meant for him, and he's an executive director, is that his responsibilities were shifting from the strategic, he's the visionary for the organization, to what he called the block and tackle. He's doing the tactical stuff every day because he was losing intellectual capacity. You had certain people on staff who knew certain things, they're gone. And now this guy is the expert in areas where other people were supposed to be experts. So one of the things that I got to thinking about that is we have a saying in fundraising, nobody ever gives away their last $50,000. Well, maybe we need to be thinking in terms of human resources. Don't let the last bit of intellectual capacity walk out the door. This is where we should be thinking about succession planning. Don't let one person hold the keys to the entire IT department or the science of the organization or the relationships of the organization, right? So there needs to be that organizational substructure to prop up everything else.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge for nonprofits in particular because you already, as Samantha alluded to, you have this industry that's kind of prone to these short tenures, and you want to look at kind of how that plays out, especially demographically. We have this kind of hourglass shape of demographics in the United States. We have a lot of older people and we have a lot of younger people. And those folks who are kind of in their 40s and 50s, those Gen Xers and older millennials, there aren't a lot of those folks who are experienced enough and ready to take on those roles where you're going to be leaning on them for that intellectual capacity. And so I think it's interesting. We're going to probably see some younger people have to be thrown into the fire, and I think that just it's gonna happen organically just because of how the demographics shake out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so one other thing I'll mention too is that, the jobs data that we get from the government is notoriously inaccurate, mainly in that it really doesn't measure people who are independent contractors and kind of a lot of the way people work in the modern society. So I think that when you're in a nonprofit, as a manager in a nonprofit, as someone who's in a hiring position in a nonprofit, that becomes a real issue because, you're probably leaning on some people who are quote unquote on staff who might not really be on staff technically. And you're having to go out more often and get some of that help through independent contractors. And I find just, anecdotally, that a lot of people who have done nonprofit for maybe 10 or 15 years, they are very prone to go out and start their own businesses. And a lot of them are very successful in doing that because the market is there to help nonprofits and to go in as an independent contractor and work with them.
Nonprofits should be open to leveraging those types of relationships, even if as a stopgap, as one staff member leaves and you're trying to bring someone on. You can use those challenges as opportunities to look at how you have been doing things and where you might be able to make some adjustments. I was talking with a client recently about having lost one of their major donor officers. And when I say one of, I mean like the major donor officer who is really managing all of those relationships, managing their moves management. And they decided to use this as an opportunity to look at how they were moving people through the donor pipeline to see if there were opportunities to improve that process. And they found some. So if people do leave, as they will, you can use that as a chance to reevaluate how you're doing things. Another thing that I think is worth talking about here is, we've all heard of exit interviews and people leaving and trying to figure out why did they leave and how can things be better the next time around. Don't wait until people are leaving to do that. Have those conversations with your staff members now. I think it's a lot like, it's easier to retain or cheaper to retain a donor than it is to bring on a new one. Generally speaking, if you can retain staff as opposed to having to start over, that's a benefit on the whole to the organization.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Samantha. And I go back to my comment earlier about succession planning, and I hear our listeners rolling their eyes at that point because most of the nonprofits are run on a limited budget, and they hear things like succession planning and think, okay, Reg, where am I supposed to get the money for extra staff for succession planning to hire that co or that vice level position? But to your point, when we talk about exit interviews, what will it take to get you to stay with this organization for 5 to 7 years? That's where we can start talking about cross-training. Take your existing staff, give them some cross-trainings, teach them some new skills. And typically what we've seen in the industry is that's what staff want to do anyway. They want to learn something new. We leave because we get bored. It stops being fun. We get stuck in a rut. So let's take the opportunity now to do that cross-training. That way you had succession planning. You had somebody else who has those critical skills that can keep the organization running should somebody leave.
Boredom and being overworked, I think those are two of the biggest drivers of staff leaving, and cross-training can address both of them.
Yeah, and I think in nonprofit too, one of the things that we see a lot of is these organizations, that staffing gets tight. People have to wear many, many hats, and you go from this kind of culture of being proactive and planning ahead and having enough staff to really cover all the bases to getting to the point where you're reactive, you're putting out fires all the time, you're really struggling with just the day-to-day operations and make sure that the ship can sail every day. And that's a tough environment to work in long term. It can't last forever. People get burned out in those environments.
You pay for it now or you pay for it later.
Yep, exactly. Well, Samantha, we've got time for maybe one more. So what else is on your mind? What would you say people could watch out for this year?
I mean, given that it's 2022, this is an election year, and every election year, like clockwork, we start to get questions about what does this mean for our fundraising? Should we expect a lower response rate, lower average gift? Do we need to adjust our budget? Do we need to adjust our schedule? So I would say the election year is the next big thing on the radar. And first off, there's great news in that research has shown that nonprofit giving does not decrease in election years, and sometimes it even increases. Particularly, there have been some small studies that have shown that donors may be more inclined to donate to causes that are associated with a losing candidate's party than they otherwise would be. So even if your candidate doesn't win, that could be good news for your nonprofit.
Samantha, can you give an example of that when you talk about a nonprofit's losing candidate?
Yeah. So, I mean, we saw this a lot in 2016 when Trump was elected. He came into office and all of a sudden, a lot of folks were giving to causes that they felt like he might not support, LGBT related charities, organizations who were working with migrants or BIPOC, people of color. So that was a very consistent trend that I don't know that it kicked off then, but it was just very clear in that moment. And like I said, the studies around that have not been as ubiquitous, but there are consistent findings in that vein. And regardless of whether giving increases in an election year or not, it certainly doesn't decrease. So first of all, nonprofit fundraising, I wouldn't adjust your budgets down. What I would do is look at the timing of your communications. So during an election year, and in particular, early voting is becoming, and voting by mail is becoming so much bigger year over year. More states are offering it. The windows are extending. When a political group sends out a mailing, they have an option of doing what's called political red tagging, which basically marks the mailing so that it goes out first, not in terms of first class, but it certainly jumps the line in front of nonprofit. Nonprofit postage is basically at the bottom. So you tend to see more delays in your mail. Obviously, mailboxes are more full, so it can be harder to get people's attention. And then as we're talking about having to deal with when this mail is going out and these production delays, you sort of have to balance when you're going to be sending out your communications so that they don't get bogged down and lost in the political noise. But you want to continue sending them because they're such an integral part of bringing those dollars in the door.
I want to share a quote from the National Council of Nonprofits, and then we can talk about it. They said, "The National Council of Nonprofits has long held that the public's overall trust in the sector would diminish and thus limit the effectiveness of the nonprofit community if individual 501c3 organizations came to be regarded as Democratic charities or Republican charities instead of the nonpartisan problem solvers that they are." So that's the quote. And in the world we live in right now, I'm not even sure if it matters if it's an election year anymore. Everything is so politically polarized that I'm sure that it's going to come to a head, right, when we all go into the voting booths or send our ballots in by mail or whatever. But it also seems to me, and I'd be interested in your takes on this, but it seems to me that political season, silly season, has been extended. And there are maybe, if you look on maybe the silver lining of that, is that there are some opportunities for your nonprofit to remain neutral, as we should for most organizations, and maybe take advantage of people's passion.
And just as a reminder, and I think that all of our listeners get this, but the IRS strictly prohibits 501c3s from participating in anything that intervenes with or participates in any campaign for an office, right?
Absolutely. You have to remain neutral as it pertains to candidates. Your mission is always your mission. So that's what you want to go back to. That doesn't mean that you can't talk about the landscape. It's absolutely critical that you do talk about the landscape, right? Because we know that the most effective appeals are timely, relevant, and compelling. I think the real question is, how do you remain timely and relevant when you couple election year results, not knowing how a given election is going to turn out, with now some of these production delays and the other challenges that you're working with? So I want to kick that one over to Russ because, you're the creative genius on this side of the table. And I'm sure you've given a lot of thought to what are nonprofits supposed to do when they don't know how an election is going to turn out, but they want to make sure that their communications are timely and relevant.
Yes. Oh, the contingency plan. It's all about the contingency plan. And I think that when you're in the creative process and you're several months out from, let's take for an example, for a presidential election, when you're several months out and you start to plan for what the message is going to be, and you really don't know who the winning candidate is going to be. And by the way, get used to that, because the last several elections we've had have been nail biters, and they're going to continue to be nail biters, just the way that the politics has progressed and the way that things operate in this country. And so I think that you have to go into it with this kind of dual purpose of figuring out your messaging in the event that your preferred candidate wins, or in the event that that candidate loses. And it's tough because you have to kind of get your crystal ball out and you have to think, well, not only from the organization's perspective, how are we going to position ourselves for this among our audiences, but how are our target audiences going to be feeling? And that was a very big thing in 2016 when Donald Trump got elected. There was real anger, and it was followed up by things like the Women's March, and it was followed by 4 years, basically, of political divisiveness and really, really high emotions. And those continue today. So it's something where I think, from the creative standpoint, from the messaging standpoint, you really should sit down and almost treat it like a rapid response strategy session, where something is coming, something's going to happen, as in rapid response. You're not quite sure what the outcome is going to be. So you plan for your contingencies and you get your messaging ducks in a row, and you bring it along as far as you can for as long as you can until you need to make some decisions. And really, production-wise, if you get it that far to production-wise where things are still up in the air, a lot of people that we work with, you're going to send two appeal letter versions of an appeal that'll drop right after the election. And you have to make that decision on which appeal to go with while it's at the printer.
So I'm going to take that from the logistical to the mission, because a lot of our organizations are still tied to those ballot initiatives, are still tied to who is in office. So here's what some of those nonprofits can do. They can still participate in voter education. They can still rock the vote or get out the vote and make sure that their constituents are educated about what is on the ballot. Stick to the facts, stay away from opinions. If you're using social media, remember that we represent the nonprofits that we work for, or the nonprofits that we serve on boards of directors. And we want to make sure that we avoid those situations that can provide blowback to the organization. And ballot measures do not equal candidates. So some of those ballot measures directly impact nonprofits. It's okay to talk about those as long as we stick with the facts.
And, we've seen that advocacy is a very powerful tool when it comes to fundraising. When you can couple an advocacy ask with a fundraising ask, you tend to increase your fundraising results. So maybe that takes the form of sending out a petition to donors or prospects, asking them, in addition to making your gift, please sign this letter to your congressman asking them to support XYZ or asking them to oppose XYZ. You can absolutely do that, and you should, because it works. I want to go back to something that Russ said when he was talking about appeal letter versions. One of the ways that you can sort of mitigate the challenges of these production delays is to have more of your content be inserted into your package when you get to the lasering portion of your production. So most mailings, unless you're printing digitally, sort of have two steps in production. First, you're press printing your materials, and then you're lasering your variable text on top of that. Some nonprofits have standard letters. They're not personalized, and so the letter is printed as art. Particularly going into this year, you may want to look at doing those two separate phases, because that allows you to print your pieces in advance without the content, the variable content on them. And then when it's absolutely time, you pick which of your letters go with and you laser them on. Not only does that allow you to pick the right path based on whatever's happened in the election or whatever else you're watching, but it allows you to personalize the letter to your donor or your prospect, which is always important. You want to be using their name. You want to be giving them ask amounts that are in line with what they've given in the past. You want to be speaking to current donors differently than you speak to lapsed donors. So I know that's a bit of an aside, but it's best practices anyway. So if you haven't been doing that with everything else we're experiencing this year, now's the time to do it.
Okay, so Samantha, let's summarize what we've talked about today. Can you give me a couple of takeaways for each of the topics that we've talked about?
I think it can really all be summed up under the idea that you need to be employing best practices. So what are best practices in fundraising? First, planning in advance, going into the year or the fiscal year with a fundraising plan, and then backing into what you need to do when in order to execute that plan effectively. So this year, you are going to be working on your direct mail packages further in advance than you would normally, but it's still something that you need to know when the package is going out so you can work backwards from there. Another best practice, treat your staff like the asset that they are. You want to avoid people leaving, talk to them, have open communication, understand what it is that they need and want from both an organizational perspective as well as a personal perspective. At the end of the day, people are people and they've got to be treated like they are valued. And then, being flexible, making sure that you do have a plan, but that you're ready to pivot. As Russ alluded to, having those 2 appeal letters ready to go so you know which one to deploy depending on how things turn out. So taking your best practices and just really committing to them and knowing that challenges are going to come up and that you've got to be ready to pivot as needed.
Thank you so much, Samantha. This has been very informative. If I may just add, be informed. Be informed on the supply chain. And we've brought it up again and again this episode, but there's so many downstream impacts from paper shortages to truck drivers to semiconductor chips that could have an effect on your mission delivery.
And I'm going to jump in with one last point, Rich. And that is to listen to your donors, listen to the people that you serve, make sure that you're meeting them where they are and that you are messaging to them in a way that's resonating with them, and really pay attention. Level 5 listening with your constituents is hugely important.
Love that we went to level 5 listening. Samantha, thank you for joining us today. Great to see you and great to hear some of your expertise.
Samantha, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And you are just one of the smartest people I know. And that's all I'm going to say.
It was absolutely a pleasure. Always is. I love talking about this stuff. And I look forward to coming back, later this year for more podcasts.
Awesome.
Super. And Russ Phaneuf, Happy New Year. I am so excited about season 3 of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, and you and I co-hosting this season together, and all of the awesome guests that we are going to have this year.
It's going to be phenomenal. And if people listen to every single episode, we're going to mail them a gift at the end of it. That's actually not true. But, if you've made it this far, the hope is there.
Right now, I think we're ranked number 8 most listened to nonprofit fundraising podcast produced by a fundraising firm made up of 3 initial acronym. So, our goal this year is to jump on up to number 7.
7's where it's at.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.
Take care.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX suggestion to contact@IPMadvancement.com. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at IPMadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.